Good afternoon. My name is Judith Ruderman, and I have the pleasure of reading to you today from Anne Fadiman. Now, we're of the generation where we may remember Clifton Fadiman, who was a wordsmith, a radio host, a TV host, an author. His daughter is Anne Fadiman, and she has either inherited or developed on her own, probably a combination, a love of words and a gift for writing. So I'm going to read to you today two short essays of hers from Ex Libris, Confessions of a Common Reader. And all her essays are about books, and they are all wonderful. It was hard for me to choose. First, I'm going to read to you from the back cover, because that's going to orient you to Anne Fadiman and to these essays as a whole. Anne Fadiman, by her own admission, is the sort of person who learned about sex from her father's copy of Fanny Hill, whose husband buys her 19 pounds of dusty books for her birthday, and who once found herself poring over a 1974 Toyota Corolla manual because it was the only written material in her apartment that she had not read at least twice. Ex Libris recounts a lifelong love affair with books and language. For Fadiman, as for so many passionate readers, the books she loves have become chapters in her own life story. Writing with remarkable grace, she revives the tradition of the well-crafted personal essay, moving easily from anecdotes about Coleridge and Orwell to tales of her own pathetically literary family. As someone who played as blocks with her father's 22-volume set of Trollope, and who considered herself truly married only when she and her husband had merged collections, she is exquisitely well equipped to expand upon the art of flyleaf inscriptions, the perverse pleasures of compulsive proofreading, the allure of long words, and the satisfactions of reading aloud. Perfectly balanced between humor and erudition, Ex Libris establishes Fadiman as one of our finest contemporary essayists. I hope you agree. I love this book. And the first essay I'm going to read is called Marrying Libraries. A few months ago, my husband and I decided to mix our books together. We had known each other for 10 years, lived together for 6, been married for 5. Our mismatched coffee mugs cohabited amicably. We wore each other's T-shirts and, in a pinch, socks, and our record collections had long ago miscegenated without incident. My Josquin Duprez motets cozying up to George's Worst of Jefferson Airplane, to the enrichment we believed of both. But our libraries had remained separate, mine mostly at the north end of our loft, his at the south. We agreed that it made no sense for my Billy Budd to languish 40 feet from his Moby Dick, yet neither of us had lifted a finger to bring them together. We'd been married in this loft, in full view of our mutually quarantined Melvilles. Promising to love each other for richer or for poorer, in sickness and in health, even promising to forsake all others, had been no problem. But it was a good thing the Book of Common Prayer didn't say anything about marrying our libraries and throwing out the duplicates. That would have been a far more solemn vow, one that would probably have caused the wedding to grind to a mortifying halt. We were both writers, and we both invested in our books, the kind of emotion most people reserve for their old love letters. Sharing a bed and a future was child's play compared to sharing my copy of the complete poems of W.B. Yeats, from which I had once read Under Ben Bulben aloud while standing at Yeats's grave in the Drumcliff churchyard, or George's copy of T.S. Eliot's selected poems, given to him in the 9th grade by his best friend, Rob Farnsworth, who inscribed it, "Best wishes from Jerry Cheevers." Jerry Cheevers, one of Rob's nicknames, was the goalie of the Boston Bruins, and the inscription is probably unique, linking T.S. Eliot and ice hockey for the first time in history. Our reluctance to conjugate our Melvilles was also fueled by some essential differences in our characters. George is a lumper. I am a splitter. His books commingled democratically, united under the all-inclusive flag of literature. Some were vertical, some horizontal, and some actually placed behind others. Mine were balkanized by nationality and subject matter. Like most people with a high tolerance for clutter, George maintains a basic trust in three-dimensional objects. If he wants something, he believes it will present itself, and therefore it usually does. I, on the other hand, believe that books, maps, scissors, and Scotch tape dispensers are all unreliable vagrants, likely to take off for parts unknown unless strictly confined to quarters. My books, therefore, have always been rigidly regimented. After 5 years of marriage and a child, George and I finally resolved that we were ready for the more profound intimacy of library consolidation. It was unclear, however, how we were to find a meeting point between his English garden approach and my French garden one. At least in the short run, I prevailed on the theory that he could find his books if they were arranged like mine, but I could never find mine if they were arranged like his. We agreed to sort by topic: history, psychology, nature, travel, and so on. Literature would be subdivided by nationality. If George found this plan excessively finicky, at least he granted that it was a damn sight better than the system some friends of ours had told us about. Some friends of theirs had rented their house for several months to an interior decorator. When they returned, they discovered that their entire library had been reorganized by color and size. Shortly thereafter, the decorator met with a fatal automobile accident. I confess that when this story was told, everyone around the dinner table concurred that justice had been served. So much for the ground rules. We ran into trouble, however, when I announced my plan to arrange English literature chronologically, but American literature alphabetically by author. My defense went like this. Our English collection spanned 6 centuries, and to shelve it chronologically would allow us to watch the broad sweep of literature unfold before our eyes. The Victorians belonged together. Separating them would be like breaking up a family. Besides, Susan Sontag arranged her books chronologically. She had told the New York Times that it would set her teeth on edge to put Pynchon next to Plato. So there. Our American collection, on the other hand, was mostly 20th century, much of it so recent that chronological distinctions would require Talmudic hair-splitting, ergo alphabetization. George eventually caved in, but more for the sake of marital harmony than because of a true conversion. A particularly bad moment occurred while he was in the process of transferring my Shakespeare collection from one bookcase to another, and I called out, "Be sure to keep the plays in chronological order." "You mean we're going to be chronological within each author?" he gasped. "But no one even knows for sure when Shakespeare wrote his plays." "Well," I blustered, "we know he wrote Romeo and Juliet before The Tempest. I'd like to see that reflected on our shelves." George says that was one of the few times he has seriously contemplated divorce. Our transfer of books across the Mason-Dixon line that separated my northern shelves from his southern ones took about a week. Every night we lined up books on the floor, interlarding mine with his before putting them on the shelves, which meant that for a week we had a hopscotch over hundreds of volumes in order to get from bathroom to kitchen to bedroom. We physically fondled really, every book we owned. Some had inscriptions from old lovers. Some had inscriptions from each other. Some were like time capsules. My major British writers contained a list of poets required for my 1970 12th grade English final. A postcard with a 10-cent stamp dropped out of George's copy of On the Road. As our piles accumulated on the floor, we had several heated debates about not just which books should go together, but where they should go. I had lived in the law for 9 years before George moved in, and English literature had always occupied the most public spot, the wall facing the front door. At the opposite end of the spectrum was a small bookshelf with a door to the right of my desk, behind which lurked the zip code directory and the complete Scarsdale diet. George thought American literature deserved this place of honor instead. If I agreed to present myself to the world as an acolyte of A.J. Liebling rather than of Walter Pater, I would be admitting that the academic I had once thought I'd be had forever been replaced by the journalist I had become. Deciding that this was the truth and that, furthermore, our entrance wall should represent my husband as well as myself, I capitulated, but with a lump in my throat. In the shelves next to our bed, we created a new category, books by friends and relatives. I'd gotten the idea from a writer friend, now represented on these shelves herself, who had done the same, saying it gave her a warm feeling to have so many of the people she loved gathered together in one place. George was initially dubious. He felt it was potentially insulting, for example, to banish Mark Helprin from the American literature canon, where he had once reposed alphabetically next to Ernest Hemingway, and force him to bed down instead with Peter Larangis, the author, under a female pseudonym, of 16 volumes of The Babysitters Club. Eventually, he changed his mind, deciding that Mark and Peter might actually find a good deal to say to one another. By far, the hardest task came toward the end of the week, when we sorted through our duplicates and decided whose to keep. I realized that we had both been hoarding redundant copies of our favorite books, just in case we ever split up. If George got rid of his beat-up copy of To the Lighthouse, and I said goodbye to my genital pink paperback of Couples, read so often in my late teens, when Updike's explorations of the complexities of marriage seemed unimaginably exotic, that it had sundered into a triptych held together with a rubber band, well then we would clearly have to stick together for good. Our bridges would be burned. We each owned copies of about 50 books in common. We decided that hardbacks would prevail over paperbacks unless the paperbacks contained marginalia. We kept my Middlemarch, read at 18, in which were registered my nascent attempts at literary criticism. Page 37, grr. Page 261, bullshit. Page 294, yuck. George's Magic Mountain, My War and Peace. Women in Love generated the most agonizing discussion. George had read it at 16. He insisted that whenever he reread it, no edition other than his original Bantam paperback with its psychedelic cover of one nude and one semi-nude woman would possibly do. I had read it at 18. I kept no diary that year, but I had no need of one to remind me that that was the year I lost my virginity. It was all too apparent from the comments I wrote in my Viking edition. Page 18, violence substitute for sex. Page 154, sexual pain. Page 159, sexual power. Page 158, sex. What could we do but throw in the towel and keep both copies? After a final post-midnight push, we were done. Our duplicates, plus another 100 or so painful culls, were neatly stacked, ready to be carted off to Goodwill. Sweating and panting beneath our triumphantly united Melvilles, we kissed. Our library was in impeccable order, but it was a little airless, much as my own life had been before George entered it. And so, by subtle degrees, as the weeks passed, George's style began to retake the upper hand in a not entirely unwelcome fashion. As the excessively rectilinear foundation lines of a new house are softened by the addition of a few wind-blown weeds here, a knocked-over tricycle there, so the flawlessness of our new system was softened by the forces of entropy and my husband, which are closely allied. Our bedside tables started to sag under the weight of new, unsorted volumes. The Shakespeares reshuffled. One day I noticed that the Iliad and the decline and fall of the Roman Empire had somehow found their way to the friends and relatives section. Confronted with the evidence, George crossed his fingers and said, well, Gibbon and I were like that. A couple of weeks ago, when George was out of town, I decided to read Travels with Charlie. I got into bed with the copy I'd first read the summer I turned 17. I was settling into the familiar feel of my crumbly old paperback, the one with Steinbeck sitting cross-legged next to his poodle on the cover, when I reached page 192. There, next to a passage about the dwindling redwood forests of California, in a younger version of my husband's handwriting, I'd recognize it anywhere, was the plaintive comment, "Why do we destroy the environment? We must have had identical copies, and we'd kept George's." My books and his books had become our books. We were really married. Essay 2 is called Never Do That to a Book. Now, any ideas what this is about if you hear the title, Never Do That to a Book? Okay, I see what you meant. Anybody have a thought? Don't turn down page. And I got something else here. Don't put the book face down. Anything else? Okay. Never do that to a book. When I was 11 and my brother was 13, our parents took us to Europe. At the Hotel d'Angleterre in Copenhagen, as he had done virtually every night of his literate life, Kim left a book face down on the bedside table. The next afternoon, he returned to find the book closed, a piece of paper inserted in to mark the page, and the following note, signed by the chambermaid, resting on its cover. "Sir, you must never do that to a book." My brother was stunned. How could it have come to pass that he, a reader so devoted that he'd sneaked a book and a flashlight under the covers at his boarding school every night after lights out, a crime punishable by a swat with a wooden paddle, that he had been branded as someone who didn't love books? I shared his mortification. I could not imagine a more bibliolatrous family than the Fatimans. Yet, with the exception of my mother, in the eyes of the young Danish maid, we would all have been found guilty of rampant book abuse. During the next 30 years, I came to realize that just as there is more than one way to love a person, so is there more than one way to love a book. The chambermaid believed in courtly love. A book's physical self was sacrosanct to her, its form inseparable from its content. Her duty as a lover was platonic adoration, a noble but doomed attempt to conserve forever the state of perfect chastity in which it had left the bookseller. The Fatiman family believed in carnal love. To us, a book's words were holy, but the paper, cloth, cardboard, glue, thread, and ink that contained them were a mere vessel. And it was no sacrilege to treat them as wantonly as desire and pragmatism dictated. Hard use was a sign not of disrespect, but of intimacy. Hilaire Belloc, a courtly lover, once wrote, "Child, do not throw this book about. Refrain from the unholy pleasure of cutting all the pictures out. Preserve it as your chiefest treasure." What would Belloc have thought of my father, who, in order to reduce the weight of the paperbacks he read on airplanes, tore off the chapters he had completed and threw them in the trash? What would he have thought of my husband, who reads in the sauna, where heat-fissioned pages drop like petals in a storm? What would he have thought? Here I'm making a brazen attempt to upgrade my family by association. What would he have thought of Thomas Jefferson, who chopped up a priceless 1572 first edition of Plutarch's works in Greek in order to interleave its pages with an English translation? Or of my old editor, Byron Dobell, who, when he was researching an article on the Grand Tour, once stayed up all night reading 6 volumes of Boswell's journals and, as he put it, quote, "sucked them like a giant mongoose." Byron told me, I didn't give a damn about the condition of those volumes. In order to get where I had to go, I underlined them, wrote in them, shredded them, dropped them, tore them to pieces, and did things to them that we can't discuss in public. Byron loves books, really he does. So does my husband, an incorrigible booksplayer, whose roommate once informed him, "George, if you ever break the spine of one of my books, I want you to know you might as well be breaking my own spine." So does Kim, who reports that despite his experience in Copenhagen, his bedside table currently supports 3 spread-eagled volumes. "They are ready in an instant to let me pick them up," he explains. To use an electronics analogy, closing a book on a bookmark is like pressing the stop button, whereas when you leave the book face down, you've only pressed pause. I confess to marking my place promiscuously, sometimes splaying, sometimes committing the even more grievous sin of dog-earing the page. Here I managed to be simultaneously abusive and compulsive. I turned down the upper corner for page marking and the lower corner to identify passages I want to Xerox for my commonplace book. All courtly lovers press stop. My Aunt Carol, who will probably claim she's no relation once she finds out how I treat my books, she places reproductions of Audubon paintings horizontally to mark the exact paragraph where she left off. If the colored side is up, she was reading the left-hand page. If it's down, the right-hand page. A college classmate of mine, a lawyer, uses his business cards, spurning his wife's silver Tiffany bookmarks because they are a few microns too thick and might leave vestigial stigmata. Another classmate, an art historian, favors Paris metro tickets or, quote, those inkjet printed credit card receipts, but only in books of art criticism, whose pretentiousness I wish to desecrate with something really crass and financial. I would never use those in fiction or poetry, which really are sacred, end quote. Courtly lovers always remove their bookmarks when the assignation is over. Carnal lovers are likely to leave romantic mementos, often three-dimensional and messy. Birds of Yosemite in the East Slope, a volume belonging to a science writer friend, harbors an owl feather and the tip of a squirrel's tail, evidence of a crime scene near Tioga Pass. A book critic I know took the collected stories and poems of Edgar Allan Poe on a backpacking trip through the Yucatan, and whenever an interesting bug landed in it, she clapped the covers shut. She amassed such a bulging insectarium that she feared Poe might not make it through customs. He did. The most permanent, and thus to the courtly lover, the most terrible thing one can leave in a book is one's own words. Even I would never write in an encyclopedia, except perhaps with a number 3 pencil, which I'd later erase. But I've been annotating novels and poems, transforming monologues into dialogues, ever since I learned to read. Byron Dobell says that his most beloved books, such as the Essays of Montaigne, have been written on so many times in so many different periods of his life in so many colors of ink that they have become palimpsests. That's a hard word. I would far rather read Byron's copy of Montaigne than a virginal one from the bookstore, just as I would rather read John Adams' copy of Mary Wollstonecraft's French Revolution, in whose margins he argued so vehemently with the dead author. Heavenly times, a barbarous theory. Did this lady think 3 months' time enough to form a free constitution for 25 millions of Frenchmen? That 200 years later, his handwriting still looks angry. Just think what courtly lovers miss by believing that the only thing they are permitted to do with books is read them. What did they do for shims, doorstops, gluing weights, and rug flatteners? When my friend, the art historian, was a teenager, his cherished copy of D'Aulaire's Book of Greek Myths served as a drum pad on which he practiced percussion riffs from Led Zeppelin. A philosophy professor at my college, whose baby became enamored of the portrait of David Hume on a Penguin paperback, had the cover laminated in plastic so her daughter could cut her teeth on the great thinker. Menelik II, the emperor of Ethiopia at the turn of the century, liked to chew pages from his Bible. Unfortunately, he died after consuming the complete Book of Kings. I do not consider Menelik's fate an argument for keeping our hands and teeth off our books. The lesson to be drawn clearly is that he too should have laminated his pages in plastic. Charles Lamb wrote, "How beautiful to a genuine lover of reading are the sullied leaves and worn-out appearance of an old circulating library Tom Jones or Vicar of Wakefield. How they speak of the 1,000 thumbs that have turned over their pages with delight. Who would have them a whit less soiled? What better condition could we desire to see them in?" Absolutely none. Thus, a landscape architect I know savors the very smell of the dirt embedded in his botany text. It is the alluvium of his life's work. Thus, my friend the science writer considers her mammals of the world to have been enhanced by the excremental splotches left by Bertrand Russell, an orphan band-tailed pigeon who perched on it when he was learning to fly. And thus, even though I own a clear plastic cookbook holder, I never use it. What a pleasure it will be 30 years hence to open the joy of cooking to page 581 and behold part of the actual egg yolk that my daughter glopped into her very first batch of blueberry muffins at the age of 22 months. The courtly mode simply doesn't work with small children. I hope I am not deluding myself when I imagine that even the Danish chambermaid, if she is now a mother, might be able to appreciate a really grungy copy of Pat the Bunny, a book that invites the reader to act like a Dobellian giant mongoose, in which Mommy's ring has been fractured and Daddy's scratchy face has been rubbed as smooth as the Blarney Stone. The trouble with the carnal approach is that we love our books to pieces. My brother keeps his disintegrating golden guides to birds in a Ziploc bag. It consists of separate fascicles, said Kim, and it's impossible to read. When I pick it up, the egrets fall out. But if I replaced it, the note I wrote when I saw my first trumpeter swan wouldn't be there. Also, I don't want to admit that so many species names have changed. If I bought a new edition, I'd feel I was being unfaithful to my old friend, the yellow-bellied sapsucker, which has been split into 3 different species. My friend Clark's 8,000 books, mostly works of philosophy, will never suffer the same fate as the Golden Guide to Birds. In fact, just hearing about Kim's book might trigger a nervous collapse. Clark, an investment analyst, won't let his wife raise the blinds until sundown, lest the bindings fade. He buys at least 2 copies of his favorite book so that only one need be subjected to the stress of having its pages turned. When his visiting mother-in-law made the mistake of taking a book off the shelf, Clark shadowed her around the apartment to make sure she didn't do anything unspeakable to it, such as placing it face down on a table. I know these facts about Clark because when George was over there last week, he talked to Clark's wife and made some notes on the back flyleaf of Herman Wouk's Don't Stop the Carnival, which he happened to be carrying in his backpack. He ripped out the page and gave it to me. They're charming, aren't they? Thank you very much. If you like these, when I read again, I can read a couple more. My pleasure. Okay, goodbye out there in 1390 land.